So, Bernie Mace, thank you.
Thank you, Steve, and thanks to everybody, one and all, for coming. The title of my presentation is something to do with my sentimentalism. The Central Highlands used to be shown on some maps. I've still got maps in my possession from the 60s and 70s that show the state forest part of the Central Highlands as a sanctuary. And I hope we can progress forward with that kind of sentiment in mind in the future. Sorry. And Melbourne's Mountain Forest Sanctuary was actually a sign. As you entered Healesville, when I first moved into the area 21 years ago, as you entered Healesville, you came to a sign on the side of the road. Welcome to Healesville, Melbourne's Mountain Forest Sanctuary. And in subsequent years, unfortunately, that signpost was demolished, but I'd love to see that kind of sentiment enter the Central Highlands communities again in the future. Before I get into my favourite topic, which is the giant and ancient trees of our forests, I'll digress briefly with a concern I have for the mountain profile of the backdrop of Healesville. That mountain with the tower atop it is Mount St Leonard viewed from Healesville, and I'm pleased to say that I took that photograph in August '09 in the post-fire recovery period, where the mountain still had its full profile. Sadly, logging commenced there in May this year, extending a coop that had been done as Steve mentioned earlier. The coop was put in 2008, and I was upset about the coop going on the north side of Mount St Leonard in 2008 because I knew nothing about it. But I was at least a little relieved that the VIC Forests approach had been to leave some buffer zone of trees along the edge of Monda Track. Consequently, you have the smooth curve of Mount St Leonard, that gentle slope down to the left there from the tower, still intact. This is the view currently, because for reasons best known to VIC Forests, they decided to remove the buffer zone of trees that they left along the edge of that coop in 2008. And when this first started happening, I was sitting at home in the early hours of the morning listening to disturbed sooty owls flying around my house and calling in a fairly distressed sort of a way. And subsequently, I made some investigations and found out what was happening, complained to VIC Forests, had a couple of meetings with them, all the time mentioning that the part of the Code of Forest Practices was to listen to interested parties, listen to the complaints of people, and take into account the tourism values and all of the values of the forest that they were harvesting. And yet, whilst we patiently and politely had meetings with them requesting that the profile of the mountain be retained and respected, this has happened to it. And sadly, we think that is just the beginning, because there are coops planned for the forested area facing us now, almost up to the tip of the mountain, above Track 11, which runs across the top of the mountain to the Donnelly's Weir Trail, which is part of the Bicentennial National Trail. This is the view up Monda Track above that coop, and you can see what it was like before it was logged. This is the view looking down from the coop, and the coop is on the right-hand side of the road, and you can see everything has been trashed. Even the tree ferns on the side of the road are lying over. And when I showed this to VIC Forests in a meeting, they said, well, that was standard procedure, and they were perfectly happy with it.
That's all right.
Well, further up onto track, you come to track 11, which runs across the face of Mount St Leonard through two coops which were proposed by VIC Forests in the new TRP application. This is track 11. This photograph shows the kind of forested environment it is, and what a magnificent part of the Bicentennial National Trail it is. It would be a catastrophe if that was logged. This is looking down from the trail towards Melbourne. From down the slope you can see the complexity of the forest environment, the huge tree ferns about 10 metres high, and of course they're directly in one of the coops that is planned. Suffice to say, we think all logging should stop on Mount St Leonard, and my neighbour James Samardzis and I have had discussions with VIC Forests and DSE, and we're investigating the process necessary to move toward having currently the state forest areas on the slopes of Mount St Leonard protected permanently in some way, either by creating an extension to the national park or by putting a special protection zone in place to protect those forests and protect the tourism values of the area. I want you to use your imaginations for a little while now. I'm trying to convey an impression I have, something that's very close to my heart, of the ancient forest that used to exist in the Central Highlands of Victoria. This magnificent painting is one of the few that I've found from pre-1900 that is evocative of that mature mountain ash forest. And I hope you'll appreciate that it's somewhat reminiscent of the Redwoods National Park. And in the late 1800s and early 1900s, people were beginning to appreciate that the mountain ash forests of the Central Highlands were indeed very special. And they contained these enormous and magnificent trees, and they had phenomenal tourist potential. This is a poster from Marysville, which says on the bottom of the poster, the tallest trees in the British Empire, Marysville, Victoria. So the tourism industry in the early part of the 20th century was very conscious of the value of the trees for tourism. This particular photograph shows a tree that was dedicated to the state botanist Ferdinand Mueller, the famous von Mueller, and the picture's taken about 1920, and this is a group of field naturalists from Healesville. That particular tree, when it was found, it was measured by a surveyor called A.D. Hardy, and it was 64 feet in circumference. That's nearly 20 metres, and it was 307 feet high, or 94.5 metres high. Now, if you take that in, that's an immense pillar of wood growing out of the ground, and that's a representative example of a mature mountain ash tree, possibly of the order of 500 or 600 years old, that used to be the dominant form of vegetation in the Central Highlands. The tragedy for me is that so much of this is gone. The excessive logging that's happened since the earliest days of settlement has sacrificed these magnificent giant trees and replaced it with smaller and smaller regrowth. And the clear felling that we've been talking about is the ultimate expression of that. Now, back in the 1800s, von Mueller was aware of the threat to these giant trees. He published accounts of trees that had been measured on the ground by people qualified to do it at 420 feet in height. And he became almost obsessed with the idea of preserving some of them for the future. What he was concerned about was the ease with which people could go around and ring bark the giant trees. It was a hell of a job to cut one down, but you could certainly ring bark one and that would kill it. It would throw out its seed to germinate more trees, or more young trees around it, which was a good thing from the forestry point of view and official procedure. But what it actually did was it dried out the forest. These became tinder-dry fuel components in the forest system, and when the huge fires happened, like 1898 fires, and 1851 fires, 1898 fires, and later, these became fueling components in the massive fires that happened in those days. The giant trees were truly a feature of the forest. I wish they were again today. This was the biggest one ever measured as a stump, 111 feet in circumference, and I think 37 feet in diameter. And you could take horses inside of it. It was so big you could take several horses inside the thing. And a whole family lived in it for a while. That was down at Tarabulga Way, called the Bulga Stump. Von Mueller left his tribute to the forests in these simple terms. I won't read it out because time doesn't permit. I hope there's some fast readers amongst you. But his overall message was to project the forests into the future unimpaired with increased riches and augmented blessings to pass as a sacred patrimony from generation to generation. He was a true scientist and a passionate man about the forests. Fortunately, there are some very old growth elements of the forest still there in the state forest parts of the Central Highlands. This is a magnificent example that my friend Brett and I discovered probably 15 or so years ago. And that tree with one huge buttress burnt off it is still 16 metres in girth, and it would probably be 18 metres in girth, and it's still living out in the Central Forests, Kalatha Creek Way. And currently it's unprotected. It doesn't even have a special protection zone protection, and we believe that treasures like this should be utterly respected and incorporated into some sort of a national park extension, or something a little bit more permanent than the special protection zones that are currently applied to some regions, because the evidence is that they get breached under certain circumstances. This is another example of a giant tree in that same vicinity. This is one called Blackbeard, and it's still there. It's relatively unprotected. We know the Code of Forest Practice says that you're not supposed to cut anything pre-1900, but sadly there's plenty of evidence that that's happening daily. And we wish to work positively on ways and means to have treasures like this recognised and incorporated into hopefully a much better protected and managed Central Highlands forest.